Good morning. Let's see. Let me open up the exam. Okay. Again, there are 42 questions. You need to be familiar with what Nazi physicians did during World War II. That was a part of the nationalist socialist regime. It was a dictatorship. They called it National Socialism, as you should remember from the readings. Just correcting spelling while I see spelling errors here. So you need to be aware of the specific things they did also in general, and this is the Nazi physicians, and whether or not there were any legal consequences for the things that they did. You also need to be aware of what the gulags were and what transpired. These were Stalin's gulags. Remember, Stalin was a leader, the leader in the Soviet Union during the Soviet period that went on from the late 1920s through the early 1990s. And of course, as you may or may not know, the KGB, the secret police, who arrested people in the middle of the night for violating the absence of free speech. They were very controlled. People were, during that era, books were banned. People went to the gulags and suffered the consequences that you're supposed to know about via this question. But anyway, one member of the KGB was Putin, who has been the non-democratic leader in Russia for decades now, since I can't remember the last leader's name following Gorbachev. Anyway, so you need to be able to recognize what happened in the gulags, what life was like for people in the gulags. You need to be aware of all the explanations for death, wrongful conviction, particularly for the death penalty. What has led, what factors led to the wrongful conviction, and then the exonerations subsequent to that. You also need to be aware of the study that talked about the factors that predicted guilty pleas in death penalty cases, false confessions, and death sentences among exonerees. In other words, among the exonerees, exonerated and not executed, what factors led to these wrongful convictions and later exonerations. And there are several questions about that. You need to be aware of the consequences, as most of you are from the things you've written over the semester, about the consequences of failing to pay fines and fees. Let's see. You need to be aware of the charges for pretrial detention. When people are charged financially, you need to know whether or not that is a violation of the 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection rights. There was one case in Minnesota that you need to be aware of with regard to pay for your stay laws in jails. So you need to be aware of the outcome of the lawsuit filed by a Minnesota law professor. So it was the outcome of that. Let's see. You need to be aware of what a debtor prison is. Those were talked about in one of the readings. So you need to be familiar with what those were and what the outcome was eventually for the use of debtor prisons. You need to be aware, sorry, revoke that last statement. You need to be aware of what's accurate and what's inaccurate with regard to descriptions of debtors' prisons that you may see. And or outcome. So what's true, what's not true. You need to be aware of the similarities or differences in terms of the laws with regard to immigrants and refugees. What are their rights? What is a refugee? How's that defined? Where do refugees come from who come here to the United States? And what happens to them after they come here seeking refuge? You need to know the methods we use here in the States to punish corporations for violating the law. You need to be aware of the factors involved in the deaths of 43 inmates and correctional officers in Attica. And so you need to know what's accurate about those killings, and what's not accurate. Now I've got a question that I need to rephrase. Let's see. That's a bad question. Give me a second here. I'm going to pause this. Okay, you need to be aware of the events that were causally related to the Attica Rebellion and those that were not. Let's see. You need to be aware of the material from the book on privilege and punishment that talked about perceptions of defense attorneys and how they saw themselves relative to their the people they were defending and their relationship with other court officials. You need to remember the differences and similarities between resistance versus resignation of defendants who were either working with or not working with their defense attorneys. You need to be aware of the wages of people who are locked up in prisons. How much do they earn when they work? You need to be aware of what kind of work they do relative to their pay and one view of that, of those wages. You had to review a Bureau of Justice Statistics document, and this has been talked about in various films, but you need to be aware of how many people are incarcerated. So that includes jails, awaiting trial, not convicted, state prisons, federal prisons. You need to be aware of other characteristics of jails, federal prisons, and state prisons. What other characteristics are there? What are the disparities? And what are the racial disparities, particularly those described in a report you were supposed to read on the color of crime? What are the racial disparities in sentencing? You need to be aware of characteristics of immigration detention centers. You need to be aware of what was described in the camps, i.e. the concentration camps that existed during the Holocaust when the Nazis were in power, what was going on in the camps and what wasn't. There's several questions about that. You need to be aware of what was going on at Auschwitz and Birkenau, which is one of the concentration camps. I gotta correct a spelling error here just a second. In general, what factors lead to wrongful convictions, not just wrongful convictions in terms of the death penalty, but in general, wrongful convictions. Let's see. Some questions about that as well, with regard to, again, wrongful convictions and homicides. Especially the gender-related issues, particularly for perpetrators and victims. You need to know the long-term consequences for folks who go to prison. In other words, if there's no deterrent effect, as was discussed, then what are the effects? In other words, if it doesn't teach them, oh, I can't do this behavior anymore, then what happens to people when they come out? And what are the disparities, racial disparities in incarceration? What are they caused by? In other words, what are the causes of racial disparity in incarceration? And remember, disparity just means difference. So is it attributed to being doing more crime? Is it attributed to discrimination? Where in the system does the discrimination happen? Arrest, trial, pre-sentence, detention before trial, et cetera, et cetera. And you need to know the relationship between having served in the military and crime. What's the relationship between slavery and county level imprisonment, pretrial detention, length of the sentence, etc.? What are the factors involved in the relationship between being a veteran and criminal involvement and incarceration? What are the issues that are connected to veterans offending? And their health, mental health, emotional health. What rights do offenders have in prison? We've talked about some of those historically. So what are their constitutional rights while they're incarcerated? Need to be familiar with those. There was an article you read about something called implementation science. And why is implementation science important with regard to what happens in prisons? You also read some information from the Prison Policy Institute. That's a great resource, just like the Sentencing Project, the Death Penalty Information Center, the Marshall Project in terms of criminal justice information and change. They're non-government affiliated, so they're very trustworthy. Not that I'm saying government information is not trustworthy, but it's good to have multiple perspectives, right? So the Prison Policy Institute offered some criticism of the way the federal government presents data on the type of people in prison. So you need to be aware of that. And you also need to be aware of the age crime curve and what that means, especially in terms of long sentences. And if you didn't read it already, I'm going to tell you, and that's the last question. We know that the age crime curve exists. That is that most offenders, male offenders, offend between the ages of 13 and 14 and 25. Women, it's a little bit later in adolescence and a little bit later in young adulthood. But if that's true across the board, that most people who do crime offend in that age group, then why do we want to sentence someone to 40 years in prison? And remember, some time ago, we read something that said most murderers who murder one person, not a mass murderer or a mass shooter, something like that, but most people who kill one person are less likely to kill again than anybody else in the general population. So why are we executing them? Why are we sentencing them to 45, 50 years or 3 life sentences? So that's the important question you have to ask yourself. That is it. I've thoroughly enjoyed having you in class. I wish you the best of luck. I'm teaching social punishment in the spring, so please tell your friends and neighbors if they want to take the course. I'm also teaching sociology of deviance. If you haven't had that course yet, probably have. It's a 200 level course. I wish you great success over the course of your life and happy holidays.